On November 24, 1991, the great musician, the legendary Freddie Mercury, died. On the anniversary of Freddie's death, KP leafed through the book of the biographer of the musician Maria Akhundova, The Story of Freddie Mercury. Many people are shocked by this book. However, can anything related to Freddie Mercury be shocking? There is no dirt in which this person has not yet been carved. It will be all the more shocking to find out that his story is a lie. From the first to the last word. Freddie Mercury is a rare exception. His biographers seem to be competing with each other. Who is stronger than him in the mud.It? Just so happened, a famous person can lead a very scandalous life, but after death, especially untimely, they forgive him everything and say only good things about him, even if the deceased drowned in sins and vices. And what did they do with Freddie's memory? What nasty things have not been attributed to him yet? It is said, they do not speak ill of the dead. But for some reason, the generally accepted rules of decency do not apply to Freddie Mercury. For 7 years he lived with Mary Austin, who was actually his common-law wife. He himself was acutely worried about his loneliness. According to his friends, he always really wanted to have a family, looked with envy at their family hearths, dreamed of children. His single life was very upsetting for him. The fact is that marriage and procreation are considered a religious virtue among the Zoroastrians. They do not recognize monasticism and hermithood, considering it a sin. If a man is not married after 30 years, he thereby commits a sin against God and his parents. It is not for nothing that many of Freddie's lyrical songs are full of the animal longing of a loner who is hungry for love. In the famous Somebody to Love, he says, "Every day a part of me dies, I can barely stand on my feet, I look in the mirror and shout, Lord, what are you doing to me? All these years I have lived by faith in you, but it does not get easier for me, Lord. Someone, can someone find me, someone I love?" When Freddie talks about the mirror, he does not mean the longing of an aging man alone. When he wrote this song, he was not even 30. The image becomes clear only if you know the customs of the Parsis. In the old days, the Parsis, like the Russians, chose a bride for a man by his parents. Often, the bride and groom did not even see each other before the wedding. Before the wedding ceremony, there was such a custom. The newlyweds with their faces covered with a veil were individually led into a room with a large mirror. The veil was removed, and in the mirror they saw each other for the first time. The custom had a symbolic meaning. Marriage was considered a union of two people who should become halves of each other. Therefore, looking at the reflection of his bride, the groom seemed to see himself and his future family life. Freddie looks in the mirror and sees only his reflection, and he does not have a bride. Relations with Mary Austin had already reached an impasse by this time. Freddie is experiencing the absence of his wife and children and dreams of a wedding, which he will never have in the future. He used the same Parsi symbol in the video clip I Was Born to Love You. Freddie's reflection in the mirror turns into the reflection of a girl. And he has dozens of such songs. The fact that Freddie died prematurely unmarried and childless is a tragedy and not at all proof of his homosexuality. The illness and death of Freddie Mercury are surrounded by a dark and very suspicious mystery. Even Peter Haugen, in the preface to his book about Queen, cautiously remarked, Freddie Mercury died of bronchial pneumonia caused by AIDS. However, we cannot say with certainty that the cause of his death was the excesses inherent in his lifestyle. We do not know when Freddie became HIV infected and also how the infection occurred, sexually or non-sexually. But then, as if afraid of his own courage, Haugen hurriedly says, "But it doesn't matter," and turns the conversation to another topic. Why not? This is very important because the answer to this question is the ruined reputation of a decent person. Haugen is right, nothing can be confirmed with accuracy due to the complete lack of information on this topic. Freddie Mercury is not the only celebrity who died of AIDS, but only the circumstances of his illness and death are still hidden from the public. About any famous person who died under similar circumstances, you can find out everything: the date of diagnosis, the year, month, and day, the name of the doctor who reported the terrible news, the number and name of the hospital where it happened, the approximate date when the unfortunate person was HIV infected, how and where he was treated, in which hospitals and clinics he was lying, what medications he took, and what procedures he underwent, how the disease proceeded, the name of the attending doctor or doctors, etc., etc. This can be found out about anyone except Mercury. There is no clear information about his illness. The few available data are scattered, chaotic and contradictory. And in fact, nothing is known. The most important thing is that no one is trying to find out anything. Biographers and journalists, big fans of digging into Freddie's dirty laundry, for some reason are not at all interested in such a sharp topic as his illness. Moreover, they directly close an obviously unpleasant topic for them, saying that no one, they say, except Mary Austin and Jim Hutton, knows when Freddie was HIV infected, and they stop talking about it. In short, no one knows, and it is not necessary. You will know a lot, dear Quinomaniacs, you will soon grow old. Bye-bye, kids, it's better to discuss cats and fish, and do not go where you are not asked. But at least those doctors who did the tests and told Freddie the terrible news should know about this. His personal doctor, Gordon Atkinson, and the doctors who treated him could not have been unaware of this. Like any resident of the UK, Freddie should have had a medical card left. He was treated for AIDS for several years, so there must be a medical history, records of the procedures he underwent, about the medications prescribed to him, consultations of specialists, the course of the disease, the date of the first record of opening the card of another HIV-infected British citizen, Farrokh Balser. Where is it all? And where are the formalities necessary in the event of death from an infectious disease, especially since Freddie died at home and not in the hospital? Where are the results of the autopsy, or at least a simple examination of the body? Where is the doctor's report? The death certificate was issued on the basis of an oral opinion of Gordon Atkinson. Why? Why was the body taken away from the house with the grossest violations of the law? Perhaps because if the formalities were followed, the doctors would find a lot of interesting things. For example, medical confirmation of the normal sexual orientation of the deceased. Or the absence of any traces of cocaine in his system, and this is a huge scandal, isn't it? It is not surprising that all this information was hidden during Freddie's lifetime. But what is the point of doing this after his death? If a famous person dies of an illness, his or her attending physician, or doctors, gives a press conference at which he or she answers all questions from the press. Gordon Atkinson did not do this, limiting himself to a few general, meaningless phrases. So did all the witnesses. But why doesn't anyone try to find out for themselves? The press and biographers, greedy for sensations, so diligently sucked Freddie's fictional gay novels, presented his death to the public with such a scandal, but no one demanded Atkinson to show a map and a medical history. Not a single wild tabloid drew the public's attention to the strange silencing of the details of the disease, not a single sensation hunter tried to get information on his own. Neither the press, which is always keenly interested in the illnesses and deaths of celebrities, nor biographers, who described the physical torments of the dying Mercury with sadistic pleasure. No one ever pinned witnesses to the wall, and not a single journalist demanded that they do not cheat and answer elementary questions. Why such indifference? And it is not necessary to say that this is a tribute to delicacy. We know what they did to Freddie's good name and memory. The analysis of materials on this topic led me to a very disappointing conclusion. Information about the illness and death of Freddie Mercury is classified. Even now, 20 years after his death. Why, if his illness is just an accident? Why such a conspiracy against the background of the most unbridled shamelessness? Moreover, 90% of the available fragmentary information is direct and outright misinformation in order to confuse the reader's head. The so-called witnesses constantly and shamelessly lie, get confused about dates, contradict each other. Freddie's friends, who poured mud on his coffin, immediately become shy and delicate when talking about the circumstances of his illness. Mary Austin, who perks up as soon as it is necessary to talk about Freddie's gay partners and turns into a partisan when asked when he was HIV infected, said in an interview that Freddie had lived with the HIV virus for at least 7 years. That is, at the latest since 1984-85. And she is lying, because the HIV-infected Freddie could not give 70 concerts a year and sing that he would still prove his innocence and innocence. And the second great initiate, Jim Hutton, named a completely different date, April 1987. As a result, Mercury's biographers write that no one knows, since we are facing a classic failure of witness testimony, completely contradictory information on the same issue. And for biographers, it is better to remain silent than to expose the lies of their dearly beloved Hutton and Austin. But Hutton is also lying. He did not give the number, the hospital, the name of the doctor, other details. To avoid questions, he resorted to a trick and said that in April 1987 he went to his parents in Ireland and learned about Freddie's illness retroactively when he returned home. The details are unknown to him, however, if he correctly named the month, then it turns out that Freddie found out about his illness for Easter. And he also said that doctors allegedly could not find AIDS for Freddie for a very long time, even when he was already infected. Other friends have omitted this topic altogether. Another example of a lie, in a number of biographies, according to Gordon Atkinson and some other false witnesses, it is said that the Mercury house has turned into a closed clinic in the last few months. Doctors and nurses were on duty around the clock at the bed, an artificial respiration device was connected to the bed, but a number of witnesses testified that there were no doctors and medical devices in Freddie's house before his death. Only Gordon Atkinson came from the doctors. And Mary Austin said that Freddie refused treatment and medications 2 months before his death, deciding not to prolong his torment any longer. This time she was telling the truth. Freestone said the same thing. Everyone who visited Freddie before his death confirmed that they did not see any doctors or IVs. Some biographers drew attention to another contradiction, but did not give any explanations. Nor did they explain why all the evidence about the last days and the death of Freddie do not coincide with each other. Atkinson said that Freddie had pneumonia. Pneumonia, along with AIDS, is named on the death certificate, where the deceased is for some reason named Freddie Mercury and immediately Frederick Balsara. But no one else talked about Freddie's pneumonia. So, the real information about Freddie's illness was hidden from us and replaced with fables. But does this mean that it is impossible to find out anything about Freddie's infection? No, it's not that hopeless. Some things can be learned without carefully hidden medical documents. Of course, AIDS is an insidious and unpredictable disease. HIV infection can remain in the body for years without manifesting itself in any way, and only then gradually turn into AIDS. The virus can kill in a year, or it can live in the victim's body for 15 to 20 years without interfering with normal life at all. The period of transition from HIV infection to AIDS varies from 2 to 3 months to 10 years. Sometimes the infected person does not get sick at all. In the case of Mercury, our task is complicated by the lack of medical documents. But, despite all these problems, something can be learned from simple observation and the available scraps of information. First of all, we need to find out exactly when Freddie was ill with AIDS. In 1988, he disappeared from public life and there were changes in his appearance. So, he was already ill that year. Since there should be an incubation period, it means that he was HIV infected at least a year earlier. In 1987, he looked normal and led an active public life, but even then he began to have health problems. In the fall of 1987, he was forced to briefly interrupt his work in the studio. The number of white blood cells in his blood is sharply increased, and these are the so-called secondary manifestations of HIV infection. In May, he injured his leg, and the cut did not heal well, and poor wound healing is one of the signs of HIV. So, we can be sure that in the second half of 1987, Freddie was already HIV infected. When did he get infected? According to all external signs, Freddie had one of the most severe and intense forms of the disease, in which HIV infection turns into AIDS as soon as possible, and the patient dies within 2 to 3 years after infection. His medical record is written on his face. He passed surprisingly quickly. Freddie's face changed beyond recognition during the year right in front of the respectable public. He looked pretty good in the fall of 1987 at a party in honor of his birthday. And then a catastrophe. A year later, he looked much worse, and a few months later, in the first half of 1989, he resembled a dried-up mummy of himself. At the end of the same 1989, it was impossible to look at him without tears. Such sharp metamorphoses indicate the intensive development of the disease. It is known that Freddie suffered from severe pain, and this is another sign of an intense form of AIDS. In addition, since 1987, he often asked the driver to stop the car and went out for a walk. This can only mean one thing: He was sick. There is a so-called acute seroconversion syndrome, which most often occurs precisely with severe forms of HIV infection and its rapid transition to AIDS, and is characterized by chronic nausea and diarrhea. Almost all the victims of this severe form of the virus suffered from the syndrome. It should also be borne in mind that Freddie lived a little longer than he should have lived with his version of AIDS, for two reasons. He was a strong, healthy, physically strong man, he was engaged in sports, his body was not weakened by alcohol or drugs, and could fight for life longer than the body of an ordinary person. Freddie became infected after 35 years, and people older than this age live with the HIV virus longer than young people. So, we found out that Freddie had an intense form of HIV. Consequently, the incubation period and the period from infection to the onset of AIDS took place as soon as possible. The first manifestations of AIDS begin from a few days to 2 or 3 months, the secondary ones from several months. In general, the incubation period of HIV in intensive forms ends after a year and a half from the moment of infection. And attacks of nausea and diarrhea can begin as early as 2 to 3 months after the infection enters the body. We know when Freddie started showing secondary signs of HIV in November 1987, when his white blood cell count jumped. This means that he was infected about a year before, at least 6 months, at most 1.5. Summing up these data, we can determine the period of his HIV infection between 1985-86 and the beginning of 1987. By the way, some biographers carefully call it 1986. It seems that the witnesses are not just lying, they are trying to explain the catastrophically intensive development of his disease. And at the same time they cover Gordon Atkinson. After all, it was thanks to his treatment that a strong HIV-infected man turned into a complete wreck in 2 years. There is a curious episode in Freestone's book. Freddie falls into a coma. The servants call Atkinson, although they should have called an ambulance. After a cursory glance at Freddie, who has begun to freeze, Atkinson says that everything is under control, nothing can be done, the patient can fall into such a state more than once and does not provide any medical assistance to the dying person. On the same day, Freddie died. So, the London luminary, like a Soviet district therapist, openly neglects his direct duties, not to mention the Hippocratic Oath. A London millionaire is not being given what an ambulance would do to any person, not an injection, not an IV. Freddie spends the last day of his life without any medical help, with the frank indifference and inaction of the doctor. Curiously, almost a few minutes before the death of his patient, Atkinson went home, saying that there was nothing to be done, as if he was doing something, and that he was going to dinner, as if he could not have dinner at Garden Lodge. Speaking about Freddie's death, for some reason he said that Freddie stumbled badly. This cannot be explained by conspiracy at that moment, unless the episode was invented by Freestone. The press had already reported about Freddie's illness. Atkinson could justify himself by saying that Freddie himself did not want to be treated or admit that he was a bad doctor and overlooked that the patient was on his last legs. But Atkinson instead told how mythical nurses and doctors were on duty at Freddie's bedside, how IVs and an artificial respiration machine were connected to him, and Atkinson did not explain why a rich resident of a modern developed country suffered from unbearable pain for months, although Western medicine had already invented strong painkillers by that time, allowing the terminally ill to live the rest of their days with minimal suffering. He did not explain why Freddie was prescribed medications that made him feel worse and worse. Why didn't the doctor cancel the diamorphium, from which Freddie was sick? As a result, he himself refused treatment, which brought him nothing but suffering. You don't need to be a doctor to know, if the patient is ill from the medicine, it must be replaced. There was something to hide in Mary Austin. She often boasts that she took care of a sick Freddie, but does not explain why he died so quickly from her care. And Joe Finelli, who was preparing food for the sick Freddie, will not say anything anymore. Shortly after Mercury's death, Finelli turned to Queen Productions with a demand for money, according to him, for treatment for AIDS. Soon he died under unclear circumstances, officially from AIDS. Shortly before his death, he looked healthy and active, until his death, Mercury continued to perform his duties and regularly visited the gym, which is strange for a patient with AIDS in the last stage. Another detective touch. Just before Freddie's death and immediately after a long conversation with him, his executor Jim Beach was sent to Los Angeles, although Freddie's condition required his presence in London in order not to arouse suspicion. Witnesses said that Freddie's death was not expected before Christmas. When Beach was informed of Freddie's death, he asked to leave the body in the house until he returned to London. As an executor, he had every right to do this. But his request was not fulfilled. Thus, the rights of the executor of the deceased and all possible legal norms were openly violated. Peter Freestone later confessed that he had not allowed his parents to see the dying Freddie. Other witnesses did not mention the visit of the Balser couple at all, although, according to all reports, they were asked to come by Freddie himself, which does not prevent some biographers from reporting that Freddie died in the presence of his family. Freestone said that his relatives were called, he did not explain who. "Did you call them yourself and didn't let them in?" The grieving inhabitants of Garden Lodge from the outside resembled murderers hiding a corpse. The witnesses deliberately exclude any role of Freddie's family in the last days and months of his life. They not only hid the fact that Freddie's body was taken away from home by his father, they say that Freddie hid his illness from his family, not wanting to upset them. Only someone who knows nothing about the Parsi family can believe this. In addition, Freddie's sister Kashmira said that Freddie informed her husband and children about his imminent end. In general, if we consider the various evidence, what happened at Garden Lodge from the outside resembles a bad detective story. The time of Freddie's death varies between 6:30, 15 minutes to 7 and 12 minutes to 7. No one except Freestone says anything about Freddie's morning attack. There are three completely divergent testimonies about his death: Clark, Hutton, and Freestone. More on this will be discussed later. Mary Austin says that she was with Freddie all day and just before his death, she, like Atkinson, wanted to go home. But, according to Freestone, Mary came to Freddie for a very short time that day and soon left. Trying to explain the departure of Jim Beach, Freestone says that he handed over his duties to Freddie's executor John Libson and his phone number was never found. But this does not coincide with the already mentioned story that Jim Beach asked to leave the body in the house before his arrival. All the witnesses say that the parents came to say goodbye to their son at the house, all except Freestone, and this is not a complete list of oddities and contradictions. It is curious that Freestone, being neither a relative, nor an heir, nor an executor of Freddie, began to deal with all the funeral formalities himself, trips to the hospital for a death certificate, calling a hearse, etc., attracted his father's funeral home to this, although legally Freddie did not give him any right to do this. With his usual modesty, Freestone explained this by fulfilling the duties of a friend. They say that there was no whip, everyone was in shock, and only he, the noble Peter, could make a decision in this situation. At the same time, he reduces the role of relatives to a consultation. Considering what a friendly book Freestone wrote about Freddie, I don't really believe it. And Freestone himself let slip in his book that 2 weeks before Freddie's death, allegedly not expecting his end within the next month, he discussed with his father the possibility of evacuating the body from the house besieged by journalists. That is, without having any rights to do so, he discussed the details of the evacuation of the body of a still living person without informing the corpse himself. Obviously, Freestone had reasons to arrange the funeral papers himself. It is known for sure that since the autumn of 1985, after moving to London, Freddie lived like a hermit, focusing on work and putting an end to his personal life. The gay legend made another serious mistake by not classifying this information. This fact was confirmed by everyone, including false witnesses, but they did not give a clear explanation of what happened. Freddie spent most of his time away from work at home. He worked hard and intensively, and in his few free days he did not go anywhere. During the vacation spent in Japan, he was not seen in any sexual adventures, led an active cultural life, was constantly in sight, under the supervision of Watanabe's guide, he was not left alone for a minute. Thus, the possibility of his sexual infection in this time period is reduced to almost zero. There is an opinion that it was in the fall of 1985 that Freddie learned about his illness, that's why he changed his lifestyle. But this version does not correspond to medical indications. In addition, an AIDS patient Mercury would not organize a difficult tour, giving 5 concerts a week. And during this period, Freddie worked so intensively that he simply did not have time for mistakes. And now let's see when the Western press found out about his illness. She officially found out about it on November 23, 1991, a day before Mercury's death. But the rumors, of course, appeared much earlier. If they appeared after 1988, when Freddie disappeared from public life and his appearance changed dramatically, this would not be surprising. But the press found out about this much earlier, even when Freddie looked great and led an active public life. Doesn't it look a little suspicious? In the fall of 1985, the Sun newspaper, followed by other yellow publications, reported that Freddie Mercury had AIDS. John Deacon in his interview denied this information, jokingly remarking, since they write about AIDS in the newspapers, it means that someone in Queen must have AIDS. No one took it seriously, and the rumor was soon forgotten. In the fall of 1986, less than 2 months after the Grand Magic Tour, the Sun newspaper reported that Freddie Mercury was being tested for AIDS. It also said that the infection was not detected, that Freddie was living with Mary Austin again, and other tabloid nonsense, but the note had a great public response. Freddie himself was not in London at that moment, he was in Japan, where he was spending a vacation. Upon his return, he was met at the airport by a crowd of journalists and bombarded with questions. Mercury called it disinformation. This could be considered an ordinary newspaper duck if Freddie really did not get AIDS. In addition, it turned out that, before leaving for Japan, he actually passed a blood test at London's Harley Street Hospital. So Sun didn't exactly lie. Maybe it was then that he learned about his illness and the information somehow got into the Sun? No. Would the Sun really hide such a sensation from its readers? Why would they cover up Mercury, saying that the infection was not detected, especially since the newspaper behaved differently a year ago? Why would they deprive themselves of such pleasure for the sake of a man whom this newspaper has hated and poisoned all his life? In addition, if you follow this version, it turns out that Sun learned about Freddie's illness before him. In the fall of 1986, Freddie Mercury had no reason to be tested for AIDS. This year was one of the most stressful and busy in his life. He has released 2 albums, 7 singles, 1 video minion and 1 CD minion, shot 6 video clips, wrote music for 2 films and 1 performance, gave 22 concerts and 28 receptions and presentations, performed at the Montreux Festival, participated in the recording of the Billy Squier album. In addition, he began working on a new solo album, making several trial recordings. With such intense rhythms of life, he had no time for entertainment, including sexual ones. And he definitely wouldn't have gone on vacation if he tested positive for AIDS. The stupid Mr. Darling from the imagination of biographers could afford such frivolity, but not the real Freddie Mercury. He would have rushed to put his affairs in order. And he goes to Japan, spends active holidays there, visits shops, theaters, shops, exhibitions, antique shops, old quarters of Kyoto. And clearly not going to die anytime soon. The video clip "This Are the Days of Our Lives" British version, the last one in which Freddie starred, was turned into a Zoroastrian prayer. Freddie, exhausted from pain, smiled and prayed. He raised his hands to the sky, raised his palm to his face in the Zoroastrian gesture of love for God, and raised his eyes shining with an unusual light. His last words to the camera were, "I still loves you, I still love you." At these words, Freddie raised his shining eyes to the sky. Then he looked carefully into the frame, bowed his head in a short bow, smiled a strange and sarcastic smile, and said these words again, and then waved his hand and left. This touching scene became a farewell. One of the biographers was surprised to note that in "This Are the Days of Our Lives," the face of the dying Freddie radiates such light and joy, which is rarely found in healthy people. That's a good point. Only this gentleman is unlikely to understand why the dying, exhausted by terrible pain, Freddie's face shone and his eyes shone. And this was the inner light, what believers call inner grace. And the shining eyes of the dying Freddie Mercury are another proof that there is a God, there is a spiritual rock, and there are righteous rock musicians to whom no dirt of their environment sticks. But biographers are not asleep, Freddie's dying should be shat. According to Hutton, they make him an angry, whining and complaining gay man who is afraid of death and forbids talking about it. And Rick Sky is raging, how could he keep silent about his illness, not make it the object of everyone's attention? He's a coward. They probably think that he should have made an advertisement for himself. Oh, I'm poor, unhappy, look at me, feel sorry for me, admire how I'm fighting the plague of the 20th century, and let's all sing hallelujah together and donate $1 to the AIDS fund. I'll show you my wounds again, look, feel, admire. Freddie Mercury would never have stooped to this vulgarity. He didn't want to be pitied, not that kind of character. And he helped other people with AIDS, donated a lot of money for them, bequeathed to establish a fund to fight this disease. He understood that he would not be saved, but he wanted others to be saved. To help the suffering people, he allowed his name to be used in the fight against AIDS, knowing full well that higher-ranking gays would use this to finally enroll him in their ranks. Rick Sky shakes with hatred and at the same time with pleasure when he talks about his death. With special pleasure, he notes the excitement around Freddie's house in the last 2 weeks of his life. One of the informants in the house reported that the end was near and the house was surrounded by crowds of paparazzi. They broke into the house, almost climbed into the windows, demanding that Freddie come out to them and leading hysterical reports from his house. Freddie was not even allowed to die in peace. The police refused to intervene, calmly watching this outrage. Everyone who came to Freddie's house in those days had to do it from the back door because when they approached the house, crowds of paparazzi rushed at them. A good live show, the press was waiting for the hated Freddie Mercury to die. And the journalists fought for the right to be the first to tell the happy news to the owners. As always, the evidence about Freddie's death is contradictory, and we have to analyze everything, trying to distinguish the truth from a lie. On November 23, 1991, a day before his death, he dictated an official statement to the press in which he announced his illness, saying that he had hidden this information in order to protect loved ones. The press erupted into hysterical screeching. Freddie was dying under the enthusiastic hooting of the press in the atmosphere of a terrible, vile and unprecedented scandal. Many newspapers have prepared nasty obituaries in advance. The press screamed about his homosexuality, but fans flooded Freddie's house with letters of support in which they stated they don't care what they say about him. Crowds of people came to Freddie's house and stood for hours in the hope of learning something about his health, which was strikingly similar to the situation around Pushkin's house in the last 3 days of his life. There are several divergent testimonies about what happened in the house itself. The truth about his death had to be hidden, as well as the truth about his life. The only witness to Freddie's death is his friend Dave Clark. On the evening of November 24, he came to his house, stayed at his bedside. Mary Austin had gone home at that time, and Freddie died in his presence. In hindsight, Hutton and Freestone tried to refute Dave Clark's testimony, saying that he was not in the room at the time of Freddie's death. Hutton even scolded Clark. To make sure once again how much you can believe this couple, let's see what they said about Freddie's death. Hutton claimed that he and Dave Clark were in the bedroom before Freddie's death. Then Freddie asked to go to the toilet. I ran down the stairs to get Peter to help me. I said to Peter, we need to change his underwear and clothes before he gets up. At that moment, Dave went out of decency. And Freddie died. And according to Freestone, Dave Clark was in the bedroom with Freddie and Hutton was in the kitchen. At that time Dave Clark came down from above and asked Jim and me to get up and help Freddie walk to the toilet. Freddie, right up to the very end, was proud of the fact that he had never been tied to a bed. For the past week, we have been taking him to the toilet and back, holding him by the arms. When we began to gently lift him out of bed, it turned out that this was no longer necessary. Freddie wasn't breathing. As you can see, the story of Freddie always resembles the movie Rasaman. There are no two coincidental testimonies. Clark said that on the last day of his life, Freddie lay on a white sheet and in white clothes, which is exactly how Zoroastrians accept death, having washed and dressed in white. And he was surprised by Freddie's calm face and smile. Mary Austin then said strange words that he chose the day of his death himself. That day, he said, I have to go, I'm leaving, but no one paid any attention to this. And it was November 24, according to the old style, the day of the death of Saint Mercury of Caesarea and Saint Mercury of Smolensk. Dave Clark later said, "I stayed with him, and he fell asleep. Freddie had a strong and courageous character and fought the disease to the very end, continuing to work and believing in God and in all the best. He was a rare person, unique and unrepeatable. I know for sure that he is in a better world. Dave Clark is a brave man." The journalists were eager to find out how the depraved dog died, and they heard such words. What he said is very important. Dave Clark said that he was sure of Freddie's posthumous fate after seeing his death. "There is nothing strange here because it was the second miracle in a row. Freddie, accused of all human sins except murder, rape and bestiality, died as a righteous man. He died of a terrible, painful illness that exhausted his entire body, but there was no agony, no wheezing, no convulsions, no face distorted by death agony. He just quietly, calmly fell asleep," as they said later, with a smile on his face. Christians in such cases say rested or departed. This is how only righteous, beautiful people die. History has preserved many testimonies of righteous deaths. Such people fell asleep with a smile and a prayer, and no one had time to understand when death came. Those who were present at such deaths had a bright, blessed feeling, and, despite the grief, they felt that death is not terrible, that it is good for someone who is no longer there, and there is no need to be afraid of death because it is not there. Terrible sinners died in a different way. It was a nightmarish sight, heavy agony, wheezing, throwing, anger, horror of the inevitable. A terrible, suffering expression froze on the faces of the dead, and the witnesses could not recover from horror and shock for a long time. The evidence of Freddie's innocence did not end there. A third miracle followed shortly after his death. When his parents came into the bedroom, Freddie was lying, so beautiful that they asked if their son was wearing makeup. The illness changed Freddie's face very much, but almost immediately after his death, he became as beautiful as before. Usually the faces of the dead are made up, Freddie didn't need it. Freddie's father took the body from the house to bury his son according to the customs of his ancestors. Of course, this is not even mentioned in any biography. Freddie was buried on the fourth day after his death, according to the Zoroastrian rite. His funeral was held in secret, only his relatives were present. The body was cremated after the funeral service. The place of burial of the ashes is unknown. Perhaps in Bombay, in the Tower of Silence. Some biographers can't even stop death, and they, following the Friends, say that Freddie's funeral was a continuation of his stunning shows. He, they say, carefully rehearsed his funeral, arranging the last stupid show, priests in white clothes, prayers in an incomprehensible language, classical music, they even had to shit on it. And to what cynicism and shamelessness it was necessary to reach in order to call the funeral service of the deceased a show. If Freddie wanted to make a show, for this he simply had to not keep the place and time of his funeral a secret. Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of celebrities would have come to his funeral. London would have remembered the spectacle for a long time. And his grave was supposed to turn into a place of mass pilgrimage. But he did not do this in order to observe the Zoroastrian rite. An even number of people present, only relatives and friends, not to save the grave. Of course, they will never say that it was a religious funeral, otherwise their employers will leave them without a salary. They couldn't hide his funeral, there were 44 witnesses there, so they talk about the religion of Freddie's parents, and they don't comment on the Zoroastrian rite or the music that was played at his funeral after the funeral service. At best, they talk about the recordings of Montserrat Cabal and Aretha Franklin, but they do not say what kind of recordings they were. Only once did they make a reservation that the Aretha Franklin song, "Take My Hand, God" was played, that is, they played a Christian rock anthem. Freddie's funeral was not at all atheistic even in their secular part. Brian May, Roger Taylor and John Deacon, immediately after the ceremony, disappeared in an unknown direction, and no one saw them again that day. Freddie's house was crowded with journalists. Mary Austin was conscientiously working out her promotion. To the amazement of the guests, Jim Hutton, Joe Finelli and Peter Freestone appeared hung with jewelry and with external signs of their sexual orientation. They said that Freddie gave them these jewels and they put them on in memory of him. Well, the performance is over, the actors have changed their clothes. They are no longer servants. The audience was offered champagne, a drink strange for a wake. It seems that the Mary Austin gang was celebrating the successful completion of the task. The press went on a rampage, spewing out streams of dirt and hatred. Famous people died of AIDS both before and after Mercury, but there was never such a scandal. Only a few newspapers and magazines had the tact to write about Freddie's death with sympathy. Many journalists wanted to please their hosts so much that they forgot about the basic rules of decency, rejoicing as if the national football team had won. In those days, you could find such obituaries in the newspapers: a vile, depraved, ambitious bisexual rock and roll star died of AIDS, a terrible price for a dissolute life. Freddie Mercury died of AIDS. Compared to the life that this bisexual singer led, Elton John is an innocent daisy. Rock has never known a more depraved singer. The death of Freddie Mercury is a good lesson for all stars who lead a promiscuous sex life. The death of Freddie Mercury is another reminder of the problem of the spread of AIDS among homosexuals. Traders led by Mary Austin told about his active gay life. Within 24 hours, the world learned that the most vile and vicious creature that the earth has ever worn had died. But they, accustomed to seeing dumb cattle in the people, did not expect his reaction. They were surprised to see that people, to put it mildly, do not like how Freddie was insulted. A flurry of indignant calls and letters fell on the newspaper offices. Feeling the public anger, the enemies retreated slightly. Freddie was talked about as a great singer and artist. One after another there were programs of his memory, TV channels played his video clips. But the press never for a minute forgot to remind him of his homosexual gulyabas and the vicious life of a gay, drug addict and a jerk. The press gloated about the crowds of celebrities who rushed to take HIV tests. There were articles that assured that Freddie Mercury was not worth the hysteria raised around his death. The newspapers tried their best, but people, no matter what, did not want to hate Freddie. It wasn't the first or the last time a rock star died. But this time it was something different. England was plunged into mourning for several days, unofficial, of course. Freddie's house was surrounded by sobbing people, and not only young Queen fans. People of different ages and classes brought flowers to his house. Whole families were crying outside his house. Despite the hysteria of the press, his death became a truly national grief. As Peter Haugen rightly pointed out, there has not been such a thing in England since the death of John Lennon. Ken Dean writes that London taxi drivers, passing in the area of the Mercury house, slowed down, dimmed their headlights and refused to take passengers. It would seem that, what do they care about a youth rock star? Ordinary people in England took Freddie's death as their personal loss, and they didn't care what they said about him. In a short time, the life and death of Freddie Mercury was falsified. Dozens of fake biographies, offensive articles and fictitious interviews were published, several fake memoirs of friends were staged, several homosexual films and performances were staged, special websites were created on the internet, people earned their money in fan clubs, and in the Mercury Corporation itself, the murderers spared no money to hide their crime, to disgrace their mortal enemy, and to neutralize his influence on the youth as much as possible. So one of the greatest hoaxes of the 20th century took place. And it will continue until millions of quintomaniacs around the world finally realize that their idol was brutally killed and they themselves were shamelessly deceived all these years. When this happens, it will be the beginning of a revolution in the minds of young people and not the worst part of it. Of course, the killers will do everything to prevent this, but sooner or later it will happen. Freddie has had enough of his martyrdom and he has suffered enough undeserved shame. He deserved a good memory and he will get it. It can't be otherwise. Maybe God allowed such an injustice for a while so that in the future his name would shine cleared of slander. This time will come, and the slanderers will be put to shame and disgraced in the eyes of people. In conclusion, I would like to recall the words of the Orthodox priest Mikhail Khatanov. They relate to another rock singer Igor Talkov, but surprisingly fit our hero, the omniscient Lord knew about the time and hour of the poet's impending death and allowed it, by his inscrutable providence, to happen in the form of a violent murder. This death was truly a martyr's death for the poet, for the truth, for the denunciation of evil, and for outstanding civil courage. Never be afraid of anything, he often said, addressing the audience during performances and encouraging them. The sufferings of those who died in torment for the truth and for their friends have a great price in the eyes of God. With them, the sufferer not only washes away many of his sins, but also creates a healthy spiritual leaven in society for the arrival of other fearless confessors and fighters for resisting evil, which is so much in this world. And when Brian May, in his memorial song No One But You, said about an angel reaching for heaven, it was not a poetic metaphor, he knew what he was saying. Years separate us from the death of Freddie Mercury, but his name is still surrounded by a wall of lies and slander. The scribblers, maddened by their own impunity, continue to shame him in more and more books and articles. My dear listener, please like and subscribe to the channel, I will be very grateful to you, thank you very much.